Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. Before we get to today's episode, we want to take a quick moment and let you know that CityWorks Expo 8, Anticipating 2050, Acting Today, will be occurring October 4th through 6th in Roanoke, Virginia. We've got some really exciting speakers and some other activities lined up that we're excited about. If you all are interested, please check us out at cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. And real quick, before we get to today's episode, just want to let you all know that we'd really appreciate if you could give us a rating or review on whatever platform you're listening to this, whether that be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever else you might be finding it. This rating and review really help other people find out about the podcast and the incredible guests that we have. But now, without further ado, let's get on to today's episode.
Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to our guest, Ms. Madhavi Reddy, the Manager of Place-Based Initiatives at the Community Development Advocates of Detroit, or CDAD, and a Detroit Revitalization Fellow. And without further ado, Madhavi, why don't you kind of tell us a little bit about what you do and how you kind of define your work?
All right. My name is Madhavi Reddy. I am the Place-Based Initiatives with the Community Development Advocates of Detroit in Detroit, Michigan, CDAD for short. We're a member organization of community development and neighborhood improvement groups. Our goal is to build neighborhood power, which we define as the ability to make and influence neighborhood decisions through our work, which is in the following sort of categories: public policy, community engagement, place-based initiatives, capacity building, and information sharing, with the goal of making sure that our members sort of have all the tools they need to create neighborhood power, and that we're working on creating a system of community development that serves all Detroit neighborhoods. So that is what I'll say about CDAD. My work in the organization is, like I said, place-based initiatives. So I do our neighborhood-based planning and placemaking. So our philosophy on neighborhood planning is that we work from a participatory framework. So we work with communities to sort of define the future of their neighborhoods by engaging in a lot of community engagement, a lot of sort of public education, and then putting all the pieces together, doing some data analysis, and making some recommendations for the future of Detroit neighborhoods. And our placemaking work really has, maybe not unique, but a little bit non-traditional, I guess. Our definition of placemaking is really simply to just bring people together to create and use great places at the heart of their neighborhoods, and that is our full definition. So we've done a few rounds of placemaking granting and working with neighborhoods in Detroit that want to do small placemaking projects.
That's interesting. I wonder, I think that we've, through CityWorks and through some of my own stuff, it's become clear to me that I think the global definition of placemaking is changing some way and coming around to your guys' perspective that is more, I think it used to be more focused on the place-specific parts, and I think that hearing you guys put the people first in that is certainly apropos, and I'm sure you guys put a lot of thought into that in some ways.
Right. I mean, when I first got to see that about 5 years ago was, sort of when placemaking seemed to be all over the place, and it felt a little new. And that we were sitting in our office and we were like, this is actually what people have been doing in their neighborhoods, particularly in cities like Detroit, where there's a lot of, land issues and vacancy, that people have sort of been coming together to use those places and make them into something new. And that's why we decided actually to get into the idea of placemaking, to make sure that our members understood that, even though this word may not be familiar to you, that's actually what you're doing. So we got into that space just to make sure that our members knew that that's actually sort of what they were already doing. That seems to happen a lot, right? Big words for things that are sort of already happening on the ground. And we just want to make sure we're connecting, because there was, at some point, there was like funding available for that kind of work in neighborhoods, and we just wanted to make sure the members were connected to that kind of opportunity.
Well, I'm also intrigued. I know you guys, a lot of your work is focused on community engagement and making sure that you start from that place. And we've seen, you know, that's obviously hugely important, but we've also seen that it's not always effective. But I'm wondering kind of what you guys have done to ensure that when you guys go into those community engagement processes that you're actually having productive conversations rather than what often happens in those meetings.
Right. I think one thing that makes our work a bit different is that, and I'm talking specifically about our neighborhood planning, is that we're always invited into a community to do it, so we don't pick and choose. So there's always some organization that has a long history in the neighborhood that invites us to do this, saying that, you know, there's all these things happening. We're seeing, you know, there's increasing vacancy. There's some safety concerns. So we get invited into a neighborhood. And the first thing we do is sort of work with that organization that invites us in to explore, like, what are their actual relationships with the people who live in the community. And if we find that maybe their relationships aren't quite strong enough, we actually work with that organization to build a community engagement strategy before we even start the planning work. And then when we get to a point where we feel like everyone is ready, like we're able to provide the technical assistance, the organization, you know, has the right kinds of relationships, we ask them to build a steering committee of people, we always say, who live, work, or play or learn in the community, with a heavy emphasis on residents. And this steering committee really guides the entire process. We have a framework that we generally follow, but we're very flexible in that if the community feels like what's outlined in the framework isn't appropriate or isn't going to work, we don't ask anyone to adhere to that. So this steering committee very often, you know, like I said a little bit earlier, talks about what is a strategic framework. These words don't make any sense, so they'll often name a planning process. We actually sit down and define the planning boundaries with this steering committee. We work with them to develop a really good community engagement strategy. We're revisiting that engagement strategy all along the whole process to make sure that we're not making decisions for parts of a community if people aren't participating. The people on that steering committee actually are the ones who do the community engagement, the physical, like door knocking or asking us to their block club meetings or any of that kind of stuff. Because, you know, we always say up front, we're providing technical assistance, but it's the community that really intimately knows itself and who we need to talk to and what are, we always talk about like shortcuts. A community would know like a shortcut through the neighborhood that I would never know. So we're just approaching it a little bit backwards. We don't ever enter into a community and then try to start something. We're always invited into a neighborhood, and that we always sort of take our cues from that steering committee, who helps plan, a series of public meetings. We design a survey together, a community engagement strategy, all of those things. So I think by having people who live in the community really define what the planning process looks like, it's very helpful. It makes us feel like we're getting the engagement part right.
Well, the first thing I heard when you're talking about waiting to be invited in, I think that, that for me takes me right back to Saul Alinsky and these basics of community organizing. So would you, in some ways, consider yourself essentially a community organizer?
I used to be, when I was in Canada, I used to do a lot of community organizing work. And I would say this is a bit different because we're really putting together a strategy. On our side, it's less about, we're the ones, helping the community make recommendations, but we're not really the ones who will end up doing a lot of the actual physical labor. So I think that's where the distinction is. After the plans are finished, it's sort of up to the community how much they want us or not want us involved in the implementation. But I think that the question makes sense because I think in in the idea of, one-on-one conversations and all that kind of like the organizing behind the community organizing, I think there's a lot of similarities.
Well, obviously, it's clear that, and in your bio, you mentioned this concept of kind of resident-led community development, and we kind of hear some of what that means in terms of putting the onus back into the community and empowering the community to take the lead on these things. But can you talk a little bit about why that kind of community development is so important for you?
I think, there are a lot of examples, and of any sort of developments, even like very local development to like all the way to like the international development scale, where a lot of decisions have been made that aren't really, they may not be appropriate for the community, and it didn't really make sense, and there was a lot of time and resources that went into things that just didn't work. And, a very simple solution would be to develop the ideas with the community. Also, there's a lot of, in Detroit specifically, there's a lot, there's a lot of historical things that have happened that have caused a lot of like distrust. And so this is, I think, one way of sort of building those relationships toward, sort of healing about some of those historic things. A lot of decisions have been made that have impacted communities negatively. And I think we just feel like this approach just makes sense to build those relationships, because when we say there's, a steering committee, it's heavy on residents, we also, make sure we let the planning department know, hey, this is happening. We make sure the city council member knows, that the city staff that works in the neighborhood, they're invited to participate. So we're also building those kinds of like long-term relationships that may have been broken along the way.
Interesting. Well, I do. There's always this question I have when I think of this kind of stuff, and I think that it's vitally important for us to engage neighborhoods. But I do often wonder if by focusing on a neighborhood level as opposed to a city level, if you wind up creating divisions that wouldn't necessarily be there, or you just. I worry that you create a sense where neighborhoods wind up in conflict over resources in some ways, and I wonder kind of how you make sure that while you're still focused in the neighborhood and you give them the power to do what they want, you also make sure that they're included on a citywide level as well.
Right. So you've actually hit on something that's really timely for Detroit. So this is actually one of the reasons why we started getting into this kind of planning work as an organization, is that there are, neighborhoods in Detroit that are doing very well. There's a lot of attention. There's a lot of investment in those neighborhoods, and then there's sort of, what we refer to as the rest of the city. And so these are neighborhoods that are saying, what about us? If the planning department is focusing on a few specific neighborhoods at a time, like what are we supposed to do until it's, quote unquote, our turn? And so this is really a way that communities feel like they still have some sort of like ownership. So I think it's less about creating competition and more about leveling the field, because that competition is sort of naturally exists. I mean, Detroit has been through a lot. There's scarce resources, and so there's no real easy answer for anyone, including like the city and the planning and development department. It's just not easy without enough resources. The city is very large. So I think we see this as a way of just sort of making sure no one really gets left behind. So there's still opportunity for people to participate in the decisions that affect their neighborhoods. They use these plans to work with city departments, but neighborhoods also use these plans to get money from funders to fund some of their own work in their own backyards.
Well, it's so intriguing. I think that I love how you've kind of framed that. And I wonder, as you go into these neighborhoods, one of the things that I always worry about is the not understanding, not politics of that community on with the big P, but the local politics, and how you guys come to grasp with the different, managing all those individual relationships that we really can't know when we go in there.
Right. It is always the thing that concerns me as a person who physically facilitates a lot of these discussions, that you really never know what is going to happen. And you are right. Every neighborhood has politics and local, neighborhood politicians. I think, the beauty of it, and I feel like I should knock on wood before I say this, is that there's so far been a lot of like natural ways where these things sort of get mediated. So if you have enough people in the room, and to me, it's really important to notice who's not in the room. So we try to do we work really hard to make sure that, a lot of different interests are represented. So there's never really an opportunity for, the one or two people who say, I speak for this neighborhood, or that have a lot of, that are like neighborhood politicians. They have some self-interest there, which is usually related to the community. But if you have enough people in the room, people's neighbors will say, you know what, that's really great, but we also think X, Y, and Z. So I think it's, that gets handled sort of at the, during the engagement process, that just by making sure that there's enough people in the room. I think the tendency in a lot of community engagement efforts is to just, if there's, 10 people in the room, that's good enough. We had a community meeting. And that dominant voices really get a chance to sort of rise to the top in that particular case. But we've tried really hard to not say, we're going to have 4 meetings and doesn't matter who comes. We're only having 4. We allow the flexibility. We have the luxury of doing that because we're working with a community. We're working with communities who generally accept the idea that this may take more than like a few months. It may take a little bit longer. So we don't, I make sure that I don't have to be held to that kind of timeline to make sure we actually get a lot of voices and that no one voice sort of dominates.
Well, I'm also intrigued from the organizational side. I imagine it's not uncommon for you to go into these situations and find an organization that thinks they know a community very well and thinks they have a lot of trust when that's actually not the case for them.
It hasn't so far happened that we've been asked by an organization that doesn't have the trust of the neighborhood, which again, I think we've been very lucky, but we have been in a situation where an organization has wanted to do this and they don't have, the staff capacity or the actual time to do it. And in those cases, it's really hard because people have, very good intentions and they do have good relationships with the community, but this is also labor intensive for the people that work with us because, it's really impossible, I think, to do a responsible community engagement job by having, me go into a community that they've never seen me. It's sort of short term. It's not permanent. So the people who work with us have to do a lot of work as well. So that's the thing that we've had. But I've been surprised. I'm waiting for the time when someone wants to do this and it's a bit trickier.
Have you had any situations where the organization that you're working with doesn't follow through with what happens in the planning that happens with the community?
You mean with at the implementation stage? We have because, not because they haven't wanted to follow through, but because there's just a lot of need and not a lot of resources. So, if the community says, in the next 5 years, we want to make sure, these 7 parks in this whole area are, up and running and they're being maintained, there's not a lot of money to do that. So all the volunteers in the world, you can keep the grass cut, but if the playground equipment is broken, there's not much to do. So I wouldn't say it's because they didn't follow through. I would just say that it's really, really hard to find resources in a city where there's just a lot of competing needs. A lot of competing need.
Well, and that's.
We're in a situation where nonprofit organizations are, competing for money with the city's planning and development department from the big funders. So it's just a lot of balancing of what is crucial, what can be done at low cost. So we talk about that in the community. So what are the things that could be handled at a resident level? What are the things that shouldn't be handled at a resident level? What's going to cost a lot? So we have those hard sort of conversations.
That's such an interesting one because I do wonder, here we're based in Roanoke, Virginia, and there's been a lot of conversations about violence in a couple communities recently, and there's a lot of anger with the city about some of those things, and it's been really interesting to see this kind of play out in terms of I don't have any answers personally, but I don't even know where the answers lie with that. But are they questions that revolve around city government, or are they questions that revolve around local or community-based action, or are they existing in the NGO nonprofit sector? Those questions are often very difficult to handle.
Absolutely. And, it actually, I think a big culture shock for me when I moved here from Toronto, when I started working, was the how normal it is for people living in Detroit to just, handle a lot of things that should be the purview of the city. So there's a lot of radio patrol. There was a lot of garbage, community saying, "Oh, we're gonna rent a truck and take the garbage to the dump." So a lot of things just sort of became normalized. So I'm in an interesting position often where sometimes there is that anger and frustration directed towards the city, and the other half of the time I'm having conversations about whether or not it's actually appropriate to expect the community to do this all the time. Should you be, cleaning your neighborhoods all the time? Do you need, is it, I mean, the number of radio patrols and all of these things related to public safety. So we have conversations about, that doesn't necessarily happen in other cities. If you want to keep doing it, that's totally fine. But I also need, as part of the education in this process, to say, this doesn't happen in every city. But I also, on the other hand, think it's amazing that people are willing to put in the amount of actual time and labor. I mean, mowing vacant lots, going to community meetings. I mean, I feel like almost every person who, at least at the steering committee level, when we're working, are professional residents. They're going to meetings every night of the week. They're doing something to make their community better. It's amazing, and I think this is my Canadianness coming out, but it's also a little off-putting to me.
Huh. Do you think that, coming from that Canadian background, did you find that it was harder to get people out to meetings in a space where that they expected someone else to kind of deal with their issues, or is that not necessarily the case?
I think in a way, yes, but also, Toronto is very densely populated. People live on top of each other in a lot of towers, and then in the communities I've always worked in Toronto were sort of neighborhoods with a lot of towers, so it wasn't a very hard sell to say you don't even have to go outside, you can come down. And then the issues were a bit different. But I think in Detroit, that because a lot of what's not going well is very obvious and has very tangible impacts on people. So if you live next to 4 vacant houses, you might want to come to a community meeting to talk about how we can work on making the neighborhood a safer place. So no, I feel like that was kind of a non-answer, but I think it's just different.
Well, this is one of the questions that I find most interesting in terms of there's a mall here in Roanoke that I go to occasionally when my wife drags me there, and it usually makes me very frustrated to go there. And part of that is because I'm fairly tapped into this community, but every time I go to the mall, I never see anyone I know. I see 1,000, 2,000 people I don't know when we go to the mall.
Interesting.
And it's how do we get those folks engaged in doing things and not just waiting for other people to do things for them?
Right. I mean, and we still have that problem in Detroit, where people think that we have these planning meetings and 500 people are going to show up, where sometimes it's 100, sometimes it's 50, and sometimes it's 10. So it's I think that's a universal community engagement struggle. And I think there are no easy real answers, unless you want to start doing your engagement at the mall, which might be interesting. I mean, that's what the grocery stores here, the local grocery stores, are a hotbed for surveying people, telling people there's stuff going on in the neighborhood.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for mega regions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guests. Thank you. Well, I do. The other question I kind of come back to, and hearing you talk about, the radio patrols, and if someone comes because they have the vacant houses around them, there's also this question too of how do you get people that that's that thing that they want to engage with. How do you get them to go outside of kind of that one area where they're interested? They're always going to be interested in engaging and engage more fully or more comprehensively in the situation.
Yeah, so that's really, really hard. Particularly also, we have some issues with like public transit, and there's a lot of people in Detroit who don't actually own a car. So there's the physical barrier of getting beyond your 1 or 2 or 3 or 4, however much you want to walk radius. And then, there's the idea of, that's not my block, that house has, because, it changes from block to block. So one house may have like a ton of houses on their block, and maybe they're a little nervous about working with people who live, on a block that don't have much going on. So there's a lot of factors to that. We're part of my job I haven't really started with. It's attached to the my position with the fellowship, with the Detroit Revitalization Fellows, is to work with our members on developing sort of a model of neighborhood collective impact. So what could that possibly look like? What kind of supports do people need to come together? So all those residents who go to all these block club meetings with all the people who work in the community, all the city staff that supports neighborhoods. So it's very in the exploratory phase, but it's very much related to what you're talking about. How do we scale that up? It's not. It's very hard work to work on your block, but in terms of like a system level, it's not very effective at changing, I think, bigger things. So that's like in terms of like community engagement. But as an organization, we have members that are across the city. There's over 100 members of CDAD, and they represent community development corporations, block clubs, some community development financial institutions, local universities and colleges. So we're trying to just connect all the dots of that like citywide work to also figuring out how do we scale that work up at the neighborhood level. So how do we make sure all the block clubs are meeting together? We have meetings 2 or 3 times a year at the city council district level. We get all of our members in a council district together and, figure out sort of what is going on in other people's neighborhoods. But I think now we're ready to explore what does that look like if it's an ongoing work that's like a long-term process and not just 1 or 2 meetings, to figure out how we can just support some of that work. And then, the long-term vision might be that if we have if we're making sure we're giving people the tools to work sort of together at the neighborhood level with all the different actors, that how do we bring, all of those tables together periodically to talk about like the big policy issues. So we're definitely thinking about that. That was a very long answer to say I'm not exactly sure, but here's what here's what I'm looking at.
Well,
we also, as an organization, sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say that also, as an organization, we're really driven by what our members ask us to do. So it's all a little exploratory, and I'm going to be speaking to our members about, how they might feel about working differently with people in their community. What kind of tools do they need? So this may be a long-term initiative.
Well, I'm intrigued by this kind of concept of with this interest in policy stuff in particular, because we all know that there are things that we can want to do on a community level that really need and require policy solutions in order to make them happen. And there's a lot of folks that aren't necessarily comfortable working on that policy level. And I wonder kind of how you mix and match things to make sure that when that is the solution that's appropriate, that's able to happen.
Well, as an organization, we do one of our main functions is to be a public policy advocate. So we have a full-time public policy manager who maintains and works on our public policy agenda, and the agenda is set by our members. So, she's working on a lot of like affordable housing tables, was really active in the community benefits work that was happening in Detroit a couple of years ago. So as an organization, it is a key part of our work is to work with our members to influence public policy at a broad sort of level. I think it's just, to me, it all like makes sense. I just think back to your original question, like it's hard to get individual people to sort of think outside of their particular blocks, but we work really hard to make sure that our, block club members, so they may be the leader of their block club or the leader of their radio patrol, that we're making sure that they're involved in deciding what goes on our public policy agenda. But I think we're probably exploring ways to do that on a more ongoing basis.
But it's kind of it all, as I'm hearing you say these last couple of things, it's really taking me back to this kind of fundamental question that we may have glossed over here, and I think that we often gloss over it in these conversations. But I wonder kind of if you have to define what this concept of community development means, how do you start there?
I have a definition of community development that I think is Detroit is the only city I've ever worked in the U.S. I will say that before I finish my sentence. But I think, working in Canada, there's a definition of community development that's sort of more universal, and maybe what's happening in Detroit is a bit different, and it might be a matter of circumstances. So I define community development less about, real estate and Main Street development and physical development, though that is certainly a part of it. But I think, my definition of community development is really more about bringing different people together to build power to actually influence what's happening. So the right to participate in decisions that are affecting you, basically the right to have agency over what happens in your neighborhood, your city. So I think, to me, it's the process is very important. And then, all these real estate related things are sort of part of all of that. But at the heart of community development, I really think it's about, people's rights and public participation related to what is happening, like the right to participate in what's happening in your own community. And I think maybe that's like a little bit, it's a little bit different than I think people would define community development around here. So we hear a lot about, real estate, just because, you have to talk about sort of land use, real estate, commercial development in a city like Detroit. But I always want to make sure we talk about the idea of agency and power alongside all of those things.
Well, kind of building on that, we talk about empowerment, and a lot of your work seems to be focused on that kind of empowerment of communities. And I wonder, in a world where that empowerment is often financial or political or whatever, how are you ensuring that these communities in the end really wind up with that power?
Well, I think, that is the $1 million question. There's so many factors that influence all this, right from the national level to what's happening at a city council level or even neighborhood politics, that I'm not sure that there's a way to ensure that is actually happening. I talk to communities about, getting together and having a plan and being organized and knowing what to do is your best chance at making sure that, your vision for your community is what actually happens. But I think there are just no guarantees in this kind of work, which makes it difficult work besides the long hours and all of those things that people usually talk about. But I think, that makes it really hard, is that there's no guarantees.
But I'm as I'm processing what you're saying, I'm wondering if I think that even by mentioning the fact that there are power imbalances, that's part of bringing about a solution anyway. Because I don't know that that's something that we really in communities often talk about is acknowledging the imbalances that exist.
Right, absolutely. So there is definitely an education component to everything that we do at CDAD, and we do talk about those things. When we talk about the nature of power, like who gets to decide is a conversation we have very often. But I've been amazed at how I feel like really Detroiters they could all be professional planners. They've been in these conversations for so long. They really understand how things work. They really understand, when to go to a zoning meeting. Like, it really is quite amazing to me how much, like, just regular folk who don't do this as a living already know. And I think that's just a function of having done this for a really long time. In terms, like, being residents, I mean, this is way before 2008. I think, there's been a lot of these kinds of discussions. So people are very, very sophisticated in their analysis of what is happening, which really, really surprised me in a very good way when I started working here.
That's what makes me want to ask what you think of kind of the future for Detroit looks like. I mean, it's such a unique thing. Are there particular challenges that worry you about where the future of the city is headed, or things that make you particularly hopeful about that community?
Well, the thing that makes me really hopeful is that the drive of Detroiters and their love of the city and their willingness to really dig their heels in. I mean, the number of people who will actually, like I said a bit earlier, engage in, physical work, will attend meetings, will come when they're called, is something I think very special. It always sort of amazes me how much people are willing to do, and they're still willing to do it. So I think that's the thing that is very hopeful. And, there's a lot that worries me. And racial equity is a real issue. I mean, this is a majority Black city, but there's racialization of poverty, opportunity. If you look at all the health indicators, they're just not, there's racialization of poor health outcomes. And that is something I think as a city we really need to talk about. So this year marks the 50th anniversary of what they call the 1967 uprising. So the rebellion in popular culture known as, a race riot. So we've done a lot as a city for this year to commemorate the 50th anniversary. So I think there's a lot of conversations being had this year that haven't happened before. So that's actually something else that makes me a bit hopeful, that a lot of these conversations are happening out in the open, which I think is not the norm. But we really need to move beyond talk and sort of do something. And then we talked a little bit earlier about, some neighborhoods having a lot of investment, a lot of attention, and some neighborhoods not. So, in my line of work, we worry a lot about, creating winners and losers, for lack of a better, more sophisticated terminology. But, what does that mean for the communities that just don't get a lot of attention? These are usually neighborhoods where people have lived there for a long time. These are Detroiters who have weathered the storm. They stayed when many of them could have left, but, for love of city, they didn't. And what is the solution? What are the interventions in the neighborhoods that are just, not on the radar for all of this investment? So that is worrisome. And I could go on, but I feel like maybe those two big things could be enough. We could talk about schools, transportation, all the issues, but I think the two that I talked about maybe are the overarching.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to me because I think that we often see, if we tie together your hope and the challenges there, that in a lot of communities, historically disadvantaged African American communities in particular, that if we look at them, there's often, and I'm speaking particularly from the experience of Roanoke, but I know that this is often true in other cases, they've been the lack of trust is so clear, and they've been lied to and taken advantage of so many times that it's really hard to get them
Mm-hmm.
engaged. And so for you guys to still have these disadvantaged communities willing to engage, is in some ways it makes me very hopeful for what those outcomes could be.
Right. I do think it's actually Detroiters are just like a very special kind of people. No, I think that means I may be becoming one. I've been here for 6 years, but you always have to have that qualifier. We know, where did you come from? How long have you been here? Which I actually appreciate. And there's a lot of really good things happening in the city. I think we just had a 45-minute long conversation where I talked about all the things that are not working well. But there are a lot of great organizations doing a lot of good work. And I mean, in terms of like things like there's more things to do. There's lots of new bars and restaurants and all of those things. But I think I always feel like it's my job to be like, yes, and there are also some things we still need to concentrate on. So we just have to make sure we don't get starry-eyed, with all these designations of like one of the cities you have to visit. A lot of places I forget what magazine named us the number one place to visit in the whole country. just to keep a balance of, there's a lot of great things going on. There's a lot of like great arts things, great music scene, really cool people trying very hard to make the city better. I just wanted to make sure that I talked about the really great things about living in this city, to balance out all the stuff that we talked about a bit earlier.
That's so fascinating because I'm sure that you, as the rest of us are, interested in this idea of Detroit having a storyteller now. And as I think about that, I think about these narratives that we have, that every city I think has conflicting narratives, and how do you balance those in many ways? Because I don't think you're right that there's certainly many positive things happening in Detroit, but you also see all these things that are difficult, and how do you kind of make those two work together, I guess?
Right, and I think that's the big question, because it's certainly easier to really concentrate on, wow, these buildings downtown and, the rents are going up. People finally want to live here. And we have this new arena. It's like, I think it's easier from a psychological perspective to want to like concentrate on all these great things, but there's work to do. And in terms of, all like cities have these sort of narratives and dichotomies, I always tell people, especially residents, I'm like, what's going on in Detroit it's unique in scale maybe, but these issues, I mean, you could find people across the country, probably across the world, talking about some of the same things. So, in a way, it's a matter of scale that makes it really unique, but these are things that are happening all over the country. The community engagement issues, some neighborhoods faring better than others. It's just not super unique to Detroit, but I think we're just facing it on a different scale.
Well, I'm kind of intrigued as you go into these different neighborhoods, or as you visit other cities around the country, kind of to build on that, your comment that these issues are everywhere. When you're visiting new places, what are those things that you look for, or what tips you off that a place is doing well and starting to grapple with some of the hard issues, or what lets you know that we really have a long way to go in this community?
That is a really good question. So through my work at CDAD, we're a core partner in a project called Building the Engine of Community Development in Detroit. It's a whole other big initiative. And through this, we've gone to visit a few cities. We went to Boston, we went to Philadelphia, we went to Cleveland, which is often, compared to Detroit a lot. And I think, I like to look at really how people are involved in making decisions. What are they doing with like land? What are their policies around land disposition? And I really like to see what the people look like in, downtown. Or is it like an integrated city? What is like, how segregated is this city? I always think a good marker of a healthy city is that you'll see a lot of different people in the same place. And that you'll maybe be able to sort of But there's a lot of transparency, so I'm not be able to predict, but I'm going to change that to say, like, there's a lot of transparency. It's easy to figure out what is going on. Things happen so fast in Detroit, and it's really hard to sort of keep up, even as someone whose job it is at an organization, whose job it is to share information. Things happen really, really quickly. I like to look at sort of diversity, what in general, so besides like who's hanging out together, but who lives in the city, where do they live? And I don't know, these like nerd, like how, like, where is is there a concentration of poverty? Where exactly is it? Does it do like social services make sense in relation to like concentration of people who need them? Or, are the services located downtown and all the people who need them live in the suburbs? So I think things that make sense, I think I always like to see whether things are, sort of being decided in a way that actually makes sense. I feel like things don't often make sense, but that's what I would like to see.
I would love for things to make sense. That would make everything better.
I mean, I feel like that's not too much to ask, but apparently it is.
Oh, my. Well, I do we kind of have to bring it to a close here, and I kind of hate to do so, but I wonder if you could share something that you've learned along the way through your work in Canada or here in Detroit that kind of has been something that you didn't expect to learn, or something that you didn't think would be so important as you do your work now.
I know you told me you were going to ask me this question, and I was frantically trying to think of an answer the whole time. I think, a lot has surprised me. I mean, it's really funny. I don't know. You can see Canada across the Detroit River, so I kind of wasn't expecting a lot of culture shock. But in terms of the work, I think really what did actually surprise me is how the level of analysis that regular people, like who do not do planning or development work as a career, really, really already understand. And I mean down to the details of which person in what department to call off the top of their heads. That really surprised me. I don't think I've seen that before. And I think it might be a function of, the neighborhood I worked in Toronto was one of the most diverse neighborhoods in one of the most diverse cities in the world. So people hadn't been there for that long. So it was really interesting for me to see how things look when people have lived in a place for generations. I don't know if that makes sense, but it really, it personally was like a big learning that, this is what it's like when people have long time roots. Because the neighborhood I worked in Toronto, it was also known as like a gateway community. People will come to that community, live for a few years, save up money, move to the suburbs. That was just what it was sort of known as, like a place to land and then leave. So it was, it's been really fascinating to see how different it is when people have literally been here for generations.
That's really fascinating, because I think that a lot of cities have started to do these leadership college type things where you go through and you learn who to talk to do what kind of thing, and it's interesting to know that. I wonder how many folks that we don't even know already have that information in the community, and how to tap in to those people that already have that knowledge and how to use that.
Right. We're not always starting from scratch. I think, you really have to enter into a neighborhood or even into like a single conversation, assuming that the person knows something about what you're going to be talking about. And if they don't, then you can have the conversation. But I think maybe a lot of people walk into a lot of conversations assuming they're starting from the beginning, when maybe that's not always the case.
Well, very, very interesting. I wonder, again, as we have to come to a close, I wonder if you could share a story that kind of touches on what you think can happen, or what you've seen happen when a community starts to come together and starts to function and thrive and work well.
Well, there is, I wouldn't call it a community because it's huge. We call it like Northeast Detroit. When I was doing work with them, we had a lot of conversations, and it was one of the first neighborhoods, the first places in the city that I worked in when I got here, talking about, how large should an area be when you're trying to do a community plan? And, the organizers of this and residents saying, we don't get a lot of attention. We really just need to be this as big as possible because we feel like this is our one chance to sort of do something together because we're often neglected and ignored, and there's a lot of industry, and we just, as a whole area of the city, don't get a lot of attention. So we worked together for a year, maybe roughly a year. We developed this big strategy. There are some recommendations, based generally, like thematically. There are recommendations that are based on, specific intersections. It's quite detailed. And, they used that plan to get an art place grant for $500,000, and they've done a lot of park renovations. So they concentrated on something that would, and they made this decision to go after this funding as like that steering committee and core group of residents who joined after the planning process to sort of figure out, what would actually make an impact. This is a grant that is for like physical work. We can't use it for sort of services, but what could we do? So they invested the money in parks, and they used the information from the community plan to figure out, which parks. And so they're building on something that says, if our young people need more things to do, let's, invest in parks, make sure there's a lot of different places to play. And I think, speaking to the key organizers, that it was really like a confidence boost. Like, oh, we thought this whole time we didn't have any attention, but, our plan brought in, $500,000, and we're having different kinds of conversations now. I think that was like a pleasant surprise for our community to just was kind of had felt ignored for a long time. I memean, there's a lot of things, have not changed. But I thought that was a good win for them.
Well, it's interesting because there's a theme that's come up with some other of the podcasts we've done is this idea of almost permission to start to do things, or the idea that you actually have agency. And it sounds like having a big win like that starts to get people thinking about, oh, what can we do next, and what's the next step that we can use our power that we've reclaimed for.
Right, and what can we do that's a bit bigger? Because these are all people who were doing things like, these are the kind of people, oh, if I have 4 vacant lots next to me, I'm just going to like mow them and, start a garden and feed the community. So people, were doing things, but I think in terms of what else could we do, or what could we do that'll create like greater impact, I think maybe they're starting to think about things a bit differently.
Well, that's I love that story to end on. And I wonder, Madhavi, where could people find more information about your guys' work if they're interested?
On our website, which is CDAD, so CDAD -online.org. The plans are there. There's a lot of information about all of the rest of our work. So that's a great place to start. My contact information is there as well.
Well, very good. If you all are interested in learning more about CityWorks Expo, you can find us at cityworksxpo.com. But thank you so much for taking the time today, Madhavi.
My pleasure. Thank you. Have a good day.
Once again, thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. We truly hope you've enjoyed today's episode and come away thinking more deeply about something than you were before. If you have, we'd appreciate a rating or review in Apple Podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this. It really helps other people find out about the podcast and the great guests that we have on. Further, I'd like to welcome all of you all to check us out on CityWorks XPO, that's cityworksxpo.com, and learn about our annual gathering, CityWorks 8, where this year's theme is Anticipating 2050, Acting Today. We're really excited about what we have going on this year and some of the speakers that we have coming in, and we hope you'll join us in Roanoke, Virginia from October 4th through 6th and be part of what's really a very special event. But for now, thanks again for listening and have a great week.